Hey guys, what's up? I've decided to share some stories of some things that I've been through in my life. And maybe I'll be able to help someone, and along the way, figure out who is the man in the mirror. The video I posted last Friday was more or less an introduction to this series. So I figured the perfect way to really kick off this new series would be to talk about something that a lot of people have problems with or deal with. And that's relationships with their parents. I don't necessarily have the best relationship with either one of my parents, but I also definitely don't have the worst. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about my relationship with my dad. Next week's video, I'll talk about the relationship with my mom. So my dad served 20 years in the Air Force. Back after they found out, they being my parents, my mom and my dad found out that my mom was pregnant with me, my dad had already signed everything for the Air Force. And for some reason, his recruiter told him that it would be a better idea if he didn't sign my birth certificate because he wouldn't have to pay child support. So he didn't do that. He ended up having to pay child support anyways, later down the road. When I was born, my mom was 16, my dad was 18, so they were incredibly young. By today's standards, they were old. My dad went to the Air Force, my mom still lived with my grandparents, so I was more or less raised by my mom and my grandparents. My grandfather worked in the steel mill, and then when he retired, he wanted to move to Florida. So I moved with my grandparents to Florida. So I was primarily raised by my grandparents. When I was younger and when we were still in Ohio, I seen my dad here and there. But once we moved to Florida, I didn't see him all that often. So growing up, really the only father figure I had was my grandfather. Real quick, I just want to say, Dad, if you happen to be watching this, I'm not trying to offend you. That is not my intentions here. I'm just telling this as truthful as I can remember it and from my side of things. If I offend you, again, that's not what I intend on doing. So growing up, pretty much my only father figure was my grandfather. And he was an old school real man. He said some stuff sometimes that was absolutely hilarious, but at first, made no sense. One of the best things that I can remember is him talking about his son, which he didn't have the best relationship with, and his son's a complete piece of shit, so I understand. But that's beside the point. He said to me one time, talking about his son, he said to me, "He's as stupid as a Christmas turkey." At first I was like, yeah, right? Hang on, what? Upon thinking about this further, I realized a Christmas turkey is kind of stupid because traditionally you have a ham on Christmas, so I guess that makes sense. I feel bad right now saying anything negative about my grandfather because he passed away just a little bit over a year ago. When I was younger, because he's an old school real man, we really didn't have much of a relationship that a father figure, that I feel like a father figure and their son, or in this case grandson, should have. I remember multiple times he told me that I wouldn't be anything if I didn't choose specific career fields. I felt like he didn't respect me as he should. I respected him. That might be because, again, he's an old school real man, so, men don't have emotions. Maybe that's what it was, I don't know. But it sucked. I feel like he didn't respect me until he worked with me. He was selling produce, and I worked with him part-time initially, and then started working with him full-time selling produce. Once he's seen my work ethic, once he's seen that when I work, I work. I bust my ass, and then I have tremendously good leadership skills, and that I'm on top of things, and I know what I'm doing, and when I know what I'm doing it. I work my ass off. I bust my ass. That's what I do. And once he actually seen that, because I felt like he didn't know who I was, that's when he finally respected me. Our relationship completely changed. Now that he's gone, it sucks because I wish that I could have got more time, especially now that I'm getting older, 25 years old, that I could sit down. I wish I could sit down and talk to him about things that go on at this point in your life. Flashing back to when I was young, talking about my actual dad now. When I was younger, my parents tried to work things out. They got married and they did that. My dad, when I was younger, was more involved with my brother and sister's life. Now, my brother and sister, they have the same dad, and I have a different dad from what they do. I'm the firstborn, so my mother was raising my brother and sister, and I was being raised by my grandparents. So when my parents tried to work things out, my dad was actually more involved with my brother and sister's life that weren't his children than he was my life. But I didn't have a bad life. by any means as far as like parenting goes, being parented by my grandparents. But it kind of bothered me the fact that my dad was more or less raising my brother and sister when they weren't his kids, but I am his kid, and he's less involved in my life than what he is in their life. That did bother me. My brother and sister's dad is a complete, full-blown piece of shit, and has, to this day, pretty much absolutely nothing to do with my sister, and once in a while has something to do with my brother. So don't get me wrong, they were better off being parented by my dad than their own dad, because he's a piece of shit. But when you're younger, you can't really wrap your mind around things like that. So I was kind of jealous of them, even though I didn't have it bad or anything. I was jealous of them that they were being, my dad was around them more than he was around me. I mean, don't get me wrong, we had visitations here and there. Like, if he was on leave or whatever, I could go, or when my dad and my mom were married, I got to, go and visit both of them and everything, but it wasn't enough. And when I got to see my dad, I think that he tried to compensate for not being there that much, because pretty much any time that I would go to see my dad, he would always, buy me something. Which I was happy to get them things, don't get me wrong. It's just, at that point in time, I didn't really think that much into it. But as I got older, it started to feel like, just because, well, he wasn't there, so now that I am here, here's these things. My parents divorced. Years later, after my parents divorced, they kind of got back together. My dad retired from the military, and he and my mom decided to move back to Ohio. I had already graduated school at this point in time, and there was no college opportunities for me where I was. So I decided I was going to move to Ohio with them. 20 years old at this point in time, and it's the first time in my life that I've actually lived with my father. And I feel like he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. At 20 years old, I'm not saying, I'm grown, I'm completely grown, I don't need... No, that's not how it was. At 20 years old, I feel like you got to parent different at that point in time. You give more guidance than you do, restricting and doing all that stuff. 20 years old, and my dad's really legitimately involved in my life at this point. It was like he had no idea what he was doing, and we did not get along at all. I'm not blaming that on him. It's not, completely his fault. It's a 50-50 thing. My fault, his fault. I didn't know who he was, and he really didn't know who I was. I was a young man, and, well, I still am a young man, but I was a young man, and he really didn't know who I was. I didn't really know who he was. He had no idea about parenting at all, and I just had no idea what was going on, and it was just it was a tough situation, because sometimes when parenting things would come down, he would try to parent me like I was 5, and it was just a huge clash, because we just could not get along, because we had no idea. It was like two strangers living in the same house, more or less. It was very difficult. Our relationship was very, I don't know, it kind of seemed forced. We tried so many different things to have a relationship, and nothing. Basically, nothing worked. Then a few years ago, I hit a really, really rough time. At 23 years old, 3 years of living with my dad, I ended up hitting an extremely rough time in my life, and I didn't have anyone else to turn to. And it took all the way to that point for us to start having a legitimate relationship. Something traumatic to happen in my life in order for us to have a legitimate relationship. It should never come to something like that. The day before my 24th birthday, my dad went into the hospital. The night of the 16th. My birthday is on February 17th. Night of the 16th, he goes into the hospital. We thought he was having a heart attack. It turned out not to be. He had really, really bad pneumonia. If I remember correctly, one lung was completely full, and one was 3/4 of the way full. I was really sick at that point in time. So when he went into ICU, I got to go in and see him once. Because of how sick I was, I couldn't be involved with anything to do with ICU. I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. Because they were talking about possibly having to intubate him. They might have to induce a coma so that, if in case it gets worse, and then he might possibly get put on this life support, and then, depending on how long the coma is, a decision might have to be made about what to do. And I was terrified, because for the first time in my life, I was actually having a legitimate relationship with my father, and now, not even a year later, I might lose him. I didn't know what to do. I was just terrified doesn't sum it up enough. I thought, finally, I'm going to have this relationship that I've wanted, and now he's gonna die. If it came down to making a decision, if he ended up having to be intubated and have to be in his coma or whatever, that decision, because I'm his only child, would be left to me. My camera died, so if the angle changed a little bit, that's why. Let's back it up a little bit before my 23rd birthday. The year previous to that, my dad and my mom split up yet again. I was very grateful for this because they cannot work together as a couple, and I already knew this, and for some reason they kept trying, and they were happier when they were apart than when they were together. So when they finally split up this last time, I was very thankful that they did, because it was better for both of them. Now let's back it up even farther. When I first moved back to Ohio, I lived with my mom, my dad, my brother, and my sister. We lived in an apartment. A couple of years after we moved up there, my aunt was having financial troubles, so we moved in with my aunt to help her from losing the house that was my grandparents' house that was left to my dad. After a couple years of being there, my dad and my mom split up, so my mom moved out. Almost a year after that is when my dad had the really bad pneumonia. He ended up making it through the pneumonia, which I was extremely thankful for. A while after that, he decided he was going to move in with his girlfriend at the time, which is now his wife, and told me that it would be a few months and then we would deal with the problems and then he would be back in the house with them or whatever it may be. So I would only have to live with my kind of an aunt and her spawn for only a short amount of time. Well, that amount of time turned into like over a year, and I was absolutely miserable the entire time, and my life took a terrible turn in 2013, last year, when it started out with me losing my grandfather. The very next day, my uncle passed, and my year continued to just go downhill from there. Late last year, with everything that was going on, I decided I needed to get out of there. I sat down and I talked to my dad about me joining the military because I needed to do something with my life. Because everything that was going on, I had to do something. I couldn't stand being 25 and feeling like I was going nowhere, doing nothing. Granted, I've made some not so great decisions in my life. All the way up until when I went back to school, I worked a lot. And when I went back to college, I felt like I couldn't handle working full-time or even part-time and going to school at the same time. I got pretty decent grades in school, so I felt like my grades would suffer if I chose to work as well. Whether this was a stupid decision or not, I don't know. Not too long after my dad went in the hospital for the pneumonia, I decided I needed to get a job. I started looking. I wasn't completely open. I didn't want to work fast food and do all that, which may have been a mistake. I don't know. Eventually, I ended up trying to work for fast food. I interviewed at a fast food restaurant, didn't get the job. I wanted a job at that point regardless of school because I wanted to move out. I needed to get out of the house that I was in. August of 2013, I decided I just could no longer deal with the house that I was in. I could no longer deal with that. I couldn't find a job. Everything was shit. So I chose to move back to Florida. Now I look back at it and I feel like I did yet again, make a terrible decision, because if I just stuck out longer there and suffered longer, I would probably be in a better place than what I am right now, and I realize that now, so that was a mistake on my end. Let's back it up before I made this decision. My dad got married to his girlfriend, now my stepmother. She's awesome. She is not afraid to say what she's thinking. She'll tell you whatever it is. Tell you where to go and how to get there, and she just doesn't have a filter, and that is awesome, because I'm pretty much that way. I love the fact that she's that way because my dad's pretty much the complete opposite, because that's what he needs as far as I'm concerned. He needs someone like that. Towards the time period in which I moved from Ohio back to Florida, my dad and I's relationship began to suffer yet again. And now that I'm back down here in Florida, it's more or less non-existent. And it sucks. I feel like part of the reason why we have the problems that we do, what if they actually are, is the same problems that my grandfather and I had. It's because I really don't know who my dad is. He really doesn't know who I am. Although I respect him for everything that he's done, serving this country, and for him having to deal with the things that he has to deal with because of serving our country that normal people never have to deal with, and I would never wish it upon anyone. But the horrors he has to live through, I appreciate everything that he's done and I respect him for everything that he's done. But because I've made some bad decisions in my time, I honestly feel like he does not respect me. But he also really doesn't know who I am. And I feel like that's the biggest part of the problem. And I really hope, because I'm 25 now and things haven't been that well relationship-wise with my father, I really hope over the next 25 years that we can actually have a good, legitimate relationship. I know there's some people out there that, like my sister for instance, that her father has absolutely nothing to do with her. Some people feel terrible because of things like that, but with how bad her father is, it's better off. She's better off to not have a relationship with him, as sad as that is to say. But with my dad, he's not a terrible person. Neither am I. But for some reason, we just don't have the relationship that I feel like we should. And I wish we did. And I don't know what to do to get to that point. If you're going through something similar, or someone you know is going through something similar, I hope that my story here helps you know that you're not alone. I know it's always helped me to know that I'm not alone in situations, that I'm not the only one going through whatever it is. I don't have an exact reason for why my dad and I do not have a relationship. I wish I did. I at least wish I knew why. I know it's a common problem, really. If you're going through something similar or whatever may be, whatever your case may be, feel free to leave it in comments. We can always continue the conversation there. I am more than willing to do that. Next week, because it's only fair, I'm going to talk about the relationship with my mother, because I know not everyone has issues with their father. Some people just have issues with their mother. So I'm going to talk about my relationship with my mother next week. So that's it. 3 things left to do as always. Comment, thumbs up, and subscribe. Later, guys.